thank you very much for joining us. My name is Nick Gold, and I am the Managing Director of Speakers Corner. And also this year, I'm the President of the International Association of Speaker Bureaus. Delighted for you to be joining us at this fourth virtual event. Since the outbreak, we've hosted a virtual speaker showcase every 2 weeks. And to date, we're very honoured to have over 1,500 of you joining us. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who are back with us for more, thank you so much for sticking with us. I always say this, and I want to stress again, we are looking to improve these events. They're very much for you guys. So please do get in touch with myself or any of the Speakers Corner team with any feedback, any topics you might be interested in or anything you feel we can be doing better. One word of thanks at this stage is to Alex Mitchell, who's been collaborating with us on these. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, he's developed a community of 40,000 plus business owners and has developed a framework for leaders across industries to share best practices. And I'd like to give a hearty welcome to everyone from the community that's joined us today. So far in these showcases, we've looked at mental health, resilience, fostering a culture to overcome adversity. And today, we're going to be looking at how to make sense of an uncertain time. The speakers we've organised today for you guys, it's to give us a bit of clarity and certainty about what the far-reaching implications of the current situation might look like. After all, right now, we're all looking for that little bit of certainty in today's rapidly evolving world. So as per usual, plan is each speaker's going to speak for 12 minutes. Paul will speak first, followed by Pippa, followed by Leonard. Hopefully at the bottom of your screen or somewhere on the screen, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. Please give it a click, and as we go through, post your questions. And what I'll do is I'll be aggregating the questions, and at the end we'll have a bit of panel discussion between Paul, Pippa and Leonard, and I'll be firing the questions off to them, and hopefully we'll get some great answers. So without further ado, our first speaker. Paul Johnson has been Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the UK's leading economic research institute since 2011. The IFS became the first organisation to win the Prospect Think Tank of the Year award 2 years in a row in 2014 and 2015. And has won Economic and Financial Think Tank of the Year 4 years in succession. Paul is also a visiting professor in the economics department at UCL and a columnist for The Times. He is a board member of the Climate Change Committee, of the Office of Tax Simplification and of the Banking Standards Board, and is currently a trustee of the King's Fund. And he came into the Speaker's Corner office a few months ago, and he blew us all away, and we were absolutely fascinated, and we were desperate to be sharing him with you all. And finally, on a virtual showcase, we've got the honour to have him. But I am delighted to introduce to you Paul Johnson.
Hello, I'm just start my video. Okay. Hi, I'm just hopefully sharing the screen here, which should work about now. There we go. Right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Nick. I'm just going to spend a few minutes, I think, not providing you with any certainty or clarity, I'm afraid, about what's going to happen and what is happening in the economy, but at least giving you some sense of at least what some of the uncertainties are. If you want to find out more about what we've been doing at the IFS, then we've published, I think, 40 pieces in the last couple of months, which you can find on the website there at www.ifs.org.uk. But let me just jump straight in by showing you this chart from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which shows their estimate of what might happen to national income over this year and then going forward. So this chart shows you GDP growth over the last 120 years. And you can see that their forecast for this year is considerably worse than for any year over that whole 120-year period. And indeed, the Bank of England reckon that this year will be the worst year since 1606. I think we can take it that that means that this year will be the worst year in history in terms of what's going to happen to our national income and wealth. That, in a sense, is a given. That is not surprising, given that we have shut down a large fraction of the economy. And in one sense, it's a strange thing to say, doesn't actually matter that much if, as the OBR and indeed the bank have in their baseline scenarios, the economy just bounces back to where it otherwise would have been within a year or two. So in other words, if we have a year or two, we have a year or less of what we've got at the moment, and then everything gets back to normal, then we don't have too much to worry about. I personally think it's quite odd that they chose those as what they call their baseline scenarios, because I don't actually know anyone who thinks that is the most likely outcome. At the very least, we have risks clearly with second waves of the infection and having to lock down again. But even if we don't have that, the chances that we can lock the economy down for 3 or 6 months, however long it is, and not suffer what in economics terms we call scarring, so not suffer from businesses closing, unemployment rising, and therefore some considerable period before we get back to something approaching normal, is extremely unlikely. And that actually will underlie a lot of what I'm going to say. If these baseline scenarios, which suggest we bounce back to normal very quickly, are right, then in a sense everything will be well. But I don't think they are right, and therefore I don't think everything will be well. So that's the sort of fundamental economic background. We shut down a chunk of the economy. Not surprisingly, we're going to have the worst year in history for economic growth. What matters next, though, is what really matters. So that's what's happened to the economy as a result of the virus and the decisions made by government to essentially shut down a large part of it. How has government responded? Well, it's responded in a quite extraordinary way with a huge package of spending. I've listed the big elements there in terms of what government's doing. Extra money for the health service and other bits of the public services. By far the biggest thing here is the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, which provides employers or employees with 80% of their previous salary, up to £2,500 a month, which the OBR now reckons will cost over £60 billion to the end of July. The Chancellor, I thought rather surprisingly earlier this week, announced that it would continue in some form until the end of October, possibly with some cost sharing with employers. So that 63 billion that you see there doesn't even include the possible cost beyond the end of July, because we don't know what the scheme will look like. And I'll come back to that scheme in a minute, because it is terribly important for the government response, terribly important for individuals, and a really difficult thing to move on from. There's been some increases in, there's been another scheme which is intended to achieve a similar thing for the self-employed. I can talk in questions if you want to know more about the details of that scheme. Some increases in the generosity of benefits, big changes in business rates, and a cost of all of those together, more than £120 billion. So £120 billion over less than a 6-month period. That is more than the cost of running the health service over that period. The word unprecedented has been used an unprecedented number of times recently, but that is a genuinely staggering amount of money for government to make available over such a short period and so quickly. So that's the response to the big hit to the economy. Take the hit to the economy and that huge response, and we now expect borrowing this year to reach £300 billion. That's about 15% of national income. That's much higher than borrowing was at its height during the financial crisis. That's easily the highest level of borrowing in peacetime in this country. And it's worth saying, I'm talking about the UK here, but most countries could tell a rather similar story. So borrowing peaked at about 10% of national income in 2010. It's looking at 15% of national income this year, so 50% higher. The government is therefore having to sell an awful lot of debt. I mean, this is another terrifying chart. It's looking to sell over £200 billion worth of debt in just the next 4 months. Again, that's more than twice the peak level of debt issuance at the height of the last crisis, and it will remain high for some considerable period. So the amount of debt that the markets need to be willing to take needs to remain high. Although, of course, the Bank of England is standing behind a lot of this with its quantitative easing program. Again, happy to say more about that if people have questions. So huge hit to the economy, huge fiscal response, huge hit, therefore, to the public finances. And going back to my previous point, what really matters here is what happens next. Bizarre to say, if the economy does bounce back to normal quickly, then actually the odd 300 billion of additional debt doesn't really matter. The government will simply take that on and it will dissipate over time as the economy hopefully grows. That's essentially what happened after the Second World War, after the Napoleonic Wars, if you want to go back that far, a big increase in debt which dissipated over time as the economy grew. What really matters, though, is what happens in the medium to long term to the size of the economy. Some of you will have seen the leaked Treasury paper in the Telegraph yesterday, suggesting the Treasury is already thinking about increasing taxes and cutting spending in the medium run to respond to what could be a persistent deficit. The key point here is if there's a medium-term loss to the size of the economy, what does that mean in simple terms? It just means we will all be poorer than we expected. If we're all poorer than we expected, then if we want public services at the level we were expecting, we'll have to use a bigger fraction of our income to pay for them. Big political questions there, big questions about the way in which that's done. Again, we could spend a long time talking about that, and happy to take questions on that set of issues. But rather than do that, I want to say a couple more things about who it is. So I've talked very much about the macroeconomy up till now. Who's being affected? Well, despite all of those government interventions, we know there's been a huge impact on individuals already. There have been 1.8 million more claims to universal credit than expected over the last couple of months. This chart shows daily claims for universal credit. You can see pre-lockdown, that was moving around about 10 to 15,000 new claims a day. It peaked at nearly 150,000 new claims a day. You can see it's been tailing off over the last month or so, but that is a huge increase in caseload. Is essentially telling us that that number of, not all of those people will be unemployed, but the large fraction of them will have lost their jobs despite the furlough scheme. What sorts of people will have lost their jobs? Well, this chart gives you some sense of where that might be going on. This is showing you the fraction of businesses in different sectors of the economy that have completely shut or had completely shut during April. You can see that 80% of businesses in, as you'd expect, in food and accommodation and arts and recreation have shut entirely over that period. Actually, quite large fractions of construction, motor vehicle and manufacturing have also shut. The result is that a quarter of staff across the economy have been furloughed, a quarter furloughed. You may have seen headlines saying half of the workforce is now paid by the government. That's because about a quarter are also public sector workers. So half of us are now being paid for by the government. Again, you can see from this why it's so difficult to move away from the furlough scheme. If the accommodation, food and recreation sectors remain closed, then you probably need the furlough scheme much as it is providing 80% of earnings. But what you don't want necessarily is doing that for other sectors where they've got more choice about what they do. There's no question that the scheme turned out to be much more widespread and much more expensive than the Treasury initially intended, because many more businesses shut down than was initially expected, perhaps because the scheme was there to allow them to do so. So moving out of that, do it too quickly, people lose their jobs, businesses go bust, and we have the scarring I was talking about before. Do it too slowly, far too expensive, and you risk keeping businesses going which don't actually have a future, and you delay the recovery. A very tough thing for government to work through. Who's being affected? What this chart is showing you is that lower earners are 7 times more likely to work in those shutdown sectors than the highest earners. Shutdown sectors, hospitality, retail, and so on, tend to have low earners working in them. So this is very unequally felt by income, by social class, also by ethnicity. Very different effects on different people in the population. Here, you see it's also very unequal by age. People under the age of 25 are about 2.5 times as likely as those over the age of 25 to be working in shutdown sectors. Affects women more than men. So again, you can look at the big overarching fiscal and economic issues that are going on, but they affect different people differently. Finally, all sorts of things for the future. I'll run through these very quickly. We've focused the health service, and there's been in the headlines today, on dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Non-urgent elective operations have been cancelled. Hundreds of thousands of patients have not had the operations they expected. There'll be long-term knock-on effects from that, as well as big reductions in those going to A&E. Even if the only thing you care about is health, then there are long-term consequences of this. We know that recessions, we know that unemployment are bad for health in the long run. They increase mortality. The last recession, best estimates suggest, added 900,000 chronic health problems to the community as a result of the unemployment that resulted from that. So that's one. There's a big set of health issues. There's a big issue, again, a generational issue. I've shown you that younger people are more affected by this than older people, but young people moving out of school and moving out of university into the labour market this year are likely to face long-term consequences for their employment and earnings. We know from previous recessions that that's true. We know also that by shutting schools, we're particularly hurting children from less well-off families. We've got some research coming out on Saturday, this weekend, surveying families, showing that children from less well-off families are much less likely actually to be getting tuition from their school, and certainly less likely to be getting tuition from their parents over this period. So we could again be increasing inequality as a result of this. I've talked about the fiscal response. It could be big in the medium term. We could end up with a very different shape of tax system, shape of public spending, and of course the structure of the economy may change as some of these sectors that are shut down now don't recover at all quickly, if at all. So all sorts of consequences here, including for people's wealth. Let me conclude by saying this probably is making us poorer into the long run. Making us poorer into the long run is going to have a series of knock-on consequences for our health, our wealth, public services, and the tax system. What really matters is much less actually what happens over the next 2 or 3 months. We know that this will be the deepest recession in history. What really matters is how we come out of that, and how well government and the Bank of England between them support us in coming out of that and don't leave us in a worse position than we absolutely need to be. And of course, in doing that, we do have to, incidentally, keep control of the virus itself. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Appreciate it. If you could just stop sharing your screen, that'd be appreciated. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you for those sobering thoughts. Just to give you a spoiler, and we have had one question, which you don't need to answer right now, but they are good. Someone's asked if there's anything positive we can take about the future and the economic recovery. It's something for you to think about while we move to our next speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Pippa Malmgren. Dr. Pippa was economic advisor to President George Bush and is the founder of H Robotics, which makes drones and digital tools. She also founded DPRM Group, which advised companies, investors and governments on how the economic and geopolitical landscape affects risk and investment. I first saw Pippa speak in 2019 at the Business Book Awards, where she won the overall book winner of the Business Book Award for the Leadership Lab. And she is an expert in helping audiences to understand investment risks better by connecting the dots between politics, geopolitics, tech and economics. Ladies and gentlemen, Pippa Malmgren.
Go. Start my video. How's that? Can you see me? All good. Thank you so much for this opportunity, because it's such an interesting time. People are so worried about what does the future hold. So let me open by saying, I think we're going to be fine. Now, that is not to say there isn't an unbelievable amount of damage done, and there's a lot of work that needs doing to get us back to anything like normal. However, what I do not envisage is that we will not have a world economy in future. And I think a lot of people right now are worried about a kind of 1930s style, many years that we never recover from this. And for a variety of reasons, that's not what I see. However, I will say that fundamentally, the first patient with COVID was a human patient, and we did triage on those human patients. The second wave of patients are economic patients and is the economy as a whole. And what we're going to find is that COVID affects those patients in very similar ways. COVID reveals the underlying pre-existing conditions. It shows the businesses that had too much debt, or the economies that had too much debt and insufficient cash on hand. It also creates a similar reaction. COVID often isn't the thing that kills you. It's your body's immune response that kills you. As it overcompensates trying to kill the virus, it also ends up killing you as well. That's what they mean by a cytokine storm. Well, the economy is similar. We see a lot of businesses that shut themselves down. It's not that the market shuts them down. They go, I don't know what my losses are going to be, so I'd rather shut down now than take the risk that my losses in future might be greater. So what we're going to find is that we have to triage the damage. And right now, nobody knows yet how big is that going to be. And we don't really know until we turn the economy back on. Therefore, these questions that get asked, do you think it's a W-shaped recovery? Do you think it's an L-shaped recovery? Is it a V-shaped recovery? I don't know why they're always letters. But I will say this, I don't think that this is linear. I think this is quantum. And we may have well end up in a situation rather like what we had in the 1920s, in the aftermath of the Spanish flu and World War I, which, you know, taken together was much worse damage than what we're talking about here. What was the result? Part of the population became like the Great Gatsby. They had assets, they had means, and they had survived. So they're like, I'm just spending money, free champagne, get me whatever is going. And I don't know how many people you guys know, but I know a lot of people who are in that mentality. They're like, let's just go live a little because we survived this. And they want to go out and spend money. Then there's another group in the 1920s. And remember, in America, 60% of Americans were on the poverty line at that period in history and could not ever quite reestablish their foothold on the economy. And that's the part we have to really be concerned about. How many people have lost their foothold and will need help reestablishing that foothold, and we'll all have to pay attention. But the reason it's important to decide, are you going to be in a linear thought process or a quantum thought process, is because I think that linear thinking causes you to say things in a state problems in a binary way. Will the economy recover or will it not? And we've been in this line of thinking for a long time. This is the same thing that makes people go, will Brexit happen? Will it not? Will Trump win? Will he not? Much smarter to say our focus should not be prediction. Our focus should be preparedness. And preparedness for a multitude of different scenarios we can hardly imagine which of them are going to materialize. And what is much more important is to keep your mind open and exercise your imagination, because recovery from an event like this is not going to be about the normal rules of the game. It's going to be about the imaginative process. And that requires you understanding that this is a little bit like being an athlete, right? You don't say to an athlete, how will you respond if the ball falls into the court in this way? The athlete just responds. And similarly, you got to decide, which game are we in? Are we playing rugby? Are we playing tennis? What kind of economy is this? What sort of rules of the game are there? And I think a lot of those rules are absolutely transformed by these events. For example, prior to this event, the business model was Silicon Valley, get a really high burn rate, hire a whole bunch of people, and you may never make a profit, but eventually someone's going to pay you a lot of money and you'll make your money through an IPO. Is that avenue still likely in the future? It's possible, but it's possible that people put a higher premium on businesses that generate genuine unimpaired cash flow and never need to go to an IPO because they generate so much money. Why would you sell it? Well, if both are possible, then we should be thinking about, how could I build a business or be part of an industry that's going to be capable to manage in a variety of different situations. So I think, again, mental imaginary flexibility and skill sets become very important in this environment. Imagination is the key, but by the way, to repurposing businesses, repurposing economies, and repurposing individuals. So your ability to project, who am I? What is my business? Is all about imagination. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I was listening to the story of a pizza company called Stone and Barrel the other day. And they only just got started making fabulous pizzas for pubs and delivering the ingredients to pubs. But then the pubs all shut, and suddenly they were just dead in the water. So what did they do? They went, let's just do home deliveries. Thriving, totally on it. Same thing with lots of other sorts of businesses. I'm in a space that's particularly interesting at this juncture in history because I'm making robotics and digital tools. And that's all about, I'm just going to give you one thing to look at. Put up my phone. It's the ability to say, I want to see my asset. Let's say it's a farm somewhere or it's a mining site. And I want to see it right now. And I want to see all the digital information about that site because I'm stuck at home and I can't get to my mining site in Africa or my agribusiness in Brazil. That's what we do. The move to digitization has happened basically in weeks, what would have required a decade. And that brings huge efficiencies that we should all think about how to take advantage of. And that leads me to a final few comments because I don't want to take too much time. I know we're on a very tight time frame. I'll say this. Digitization was coming anyway. It's just coming a lot faster now. And we can be afraid of it, or we can go back in history and say, you know what, every time we've had more automation, more robotics, more shift in the direction of what digitization represents, actually, we have ended up with higher unemployment every single time. I mean, the first digital robotic tool was introduced in 1804. It was the Jacquard weaving loom. But I look around the world before COVID happened, and what did we see? Record employment everywhere. So I think automation, digitization, robotics they are disruptive. They absolutely mean all of us have to change how we do and what we're doing, and everybody will have to adapt to those changes. However, it does not mean mass unemployment. It just means we got to do things differently. And so the last little thing I'll say about all this is the supply chain has been broken at both ends, demand and supply. Globalization as we had defined it is over. But the new version is already with us. So the old version of globalization was all the jobs and all the manufacturing went to China. The new version is all the jobs and all the manufacturing are going to happen locally everywhere. We're going to see lots of production. So if you ask the question, why didn't we have enough ventilators? Answer, because prior to COVID, every single investor in the world said, I'm not touching hardware. That all goes to China. I'll only invest in software. Now investors are going, actually, if you want ventilators, you have to invest in manufacturing. That's happening. And so this is what I mean by the rules of the game are changing. I will draw your attention. I don't know if there's a way to put up on the site. There's one video I would recommend you watch that'll maybe help you in your own thought process. And it's called The War on Sense Making by a guy called Daniel Schmachtenberger. It's on YouTube, The War on Sense Making. It's about an hour and 45 minutes long. I strongly recommend you take the time because he helps you understand why you can't make sense of anything and therefore get you on a road to a world where you can. So I'll finish. I think we're going to be fine. It's going to be bumpy. It's going to be tricky. It's going to require a lot of imagination, but we're going to be okay. I'll finish.
Thank you so much indeed, Pippa. And we will definitely get that link up on the site to make sure that people can view it afterwards and take the time to enjoy it. Our final speaker for the day is all the way from early in the morning in Vancouver. I'm really happy to welcome Leonard Brody. Leonard is an award-winning entrepreneur, venture capitalist, best-selling author, and a two-time Emmy-nominated media visionary. Leonard has helped in raising millions of dollars for startup companies, been through one of the largest internet IPOs in history. He was the president of the Innovation and Digital Group for the Anschutz Group Company, one of the largest live sport and entertainment businesses on the planet. He is currently the co-founder and chairman of Creative Labs, a joint venture with Creative Artists Agency. And Leonard had always said to me he's a big, big football fan, and he calls it soccer. And then he went off and became co-owner of Coventry City Football Club. Now, for me, is that a football fan? I'm not sure, but I'm sure he can justify himself to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, delighted to welcome Leonard Brody.
Thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate it. And really, thank you very much for having me. I am super grateful, and it's always nice to be able to get communicating with people. I'm going to try, even though you are an Arsenal fan, I won't hold that against you. But I do, I want to make sure that I can share my screen here. and we are not having a ton of luck. Let me just quickly fix something for you here, Nick, because I think your system is a bit different than mine. Hold on one sec.
No problem.
It's not letting me share, but I'm going to try. Here. This should fix it. No. You know what? It's not going to let me screen share just because of the system. So we'll keep going, and I'll keep talking through. So I think my world started a little bit differently than a typical economist's life would start. So I didn't actually begin my life as an economist, nor am I a trained economist, but most of my career has been spent in building businesses that we would think of on the digital front in the digital economy. So I started about 20 years ago developing roughly what's now about 35 startup companies, and each of them had differing moments of success, and some we took public and some we sold. But roughly about, I would say, 10 years ago, I started getting very, very fascinated with the process around what was going on that felt slightly different. So there was something here right after about the turn of 2010 that started to feel dramatically different. And so myself and some of the editors at Forbes started engaging in some research that really tried to answer a very simple question. How is this different? Is it different at all? Because it certainly felt around the time of 2010 that this was substantially different. And generally speaking, when you can pinpoint this moment in time, we kind of counted backwards. And so the research that we've been doing now, which started a decade ago, was really about these very moments. It was about the moment where we see these phenomenal rewrites of the planet. And so we wrote a big piece on this called The Great Rewrite, and it turned out to be more poignant than ever now than it even was 10 years ago. And you could really pinpoint that moment in time to basically the start of the iPhone. So when you went back to 2007, you could realize that there was something clearly different about what had happened in that period than the periods before it. And the best way to think about that was we were rewriting the planet from the ground up. It was almost as if you were pressing the reset button on the operating system of the planet. And it seemed very obvious, and it seemed to us to be a clear pattern. But when we started looking at it and looking at a bit more detail, we realized that, in fact, it was a clearly definable pattern. And that when you think about the world and its history, it's both complex and simple at the same time. And generally speaking, when we define something as a rewrite of the planet, these patterns of rewrites that we go through, it's not exactly easy to sort of understand in exact science, but what you're generally looking for is about a 35% shift in consumer communication behavior, typically on a global scale. And when you look at that, you can go back to about 1749. And if you count from about 1749 backwards, you will see that predominantly the world just didn't change. It was almost exactly the same. If you looked at the predominant metrics we would try to define as advancement, so infant mortality rates, life expectancy, GDP rates, prior to 1749, the world was pretty much the same. And then in 1750, when the Industrial Revolution begins, you start to see a pattern emerge. And that pattern is definable and repeatable, and we've been doing it for about 400 years. And the pattern is generally the following three cycles. So it starts with a reset. That reset, think of it as a computer, and somebody's pushing their finger on the button to reset the computer. There are typically only four causes of these resets over the last 400 years. It would be technology, financial, war, or medical. Those are your four drivers of what's actually causing the changes. Then once you hit that reset, once that finger is on the button, whether it was World War I or World War II, or it could have been the Spanish flu, it could now currently in COVID. The second phase of this pattern is when your finger comes off that button, you generally enter into a devaluatory period or a devaluation. Now, historically speaking, over the last 400 years, that devaluation period typically lasts 9 to 16 months. Could be a little shorter, could be a little longer. And as Pippa mentioned, we don't exactly know in this circumstance, but if I was a betting person and I was putting money on it, I would say the pattern would repeat. And that we are likely looking at a stage 2, which is a devaluation period of 9 to 16 months. The interesting part of it is the third step of this definable pattern is always growth. So at the end of these periods, you always begin a growth cycle, and that growth cycle is often unprecedented in size from the one prior to it. So when you think about this, as everyone starts to panic a little bit and everyone starts to get intense, there's a human quality that social media has unfortunately amplified, which is our need and love for drama. And so what happens in these cycles is everybody's inner drama comes out and we look for the worst and we think of the worst. But the first thing I would say to you is take comfort in the fact that this is a pattern and it is a repeated, definable pattern. The key to the pattern that I think everyone is trying to grasp their heads around is, generally speaking, 90% of the world returns to normal. So this whole conversation that we get in now, will people go back into shopping malls? Will they go watch sports games again? Will they get on airplanes? The answer is yes. 100% they will do it. And the question is, in almost every single one of these circumstances, you see 90% of the world return to normal. Humans are quite elastic. Generally, 10% becomes what we think of, or what's always being overused as, the new normal. And in that context, you can take comfort in knowing that, like, generally speaking, while there will be economic damage and we will enter this devaluation period, that when we come out the other end on the growth cycle, generally things will return to normal. The art form, though, the key here is when you enter in this pattern, so you go from reset to devaluation to growth, 90% returns to normal, 10% becomes a new normal. And by the way, I'll give you an example of a new normal. If you go back to one of the last reset periods, which was 2008, look at the world of software. In 2006, 2007, the vast majority of software was sold through an enterprise license. But as we started to go through this period of devaluation, we ended up in a place where it became really expensive to have salespeople selling software. And all of a sudden in 2008, upwards into 2011 and 12 and up, you see the SaaS model become predominant. Almost no one sells enterprise licenses anymore. And it's an example of the thing that you have to watch for in all of this. And the thing you have to watch for in all of this is what happens in the growth cycle is that 10% new normal can begin to erode the 90% that was the normal. And so the art form is trying to figure out that 10% as it erodes that 90% over the growth cycle. The other thing that I would say you want to be really aware of, when we did our research on this, it was clear that a lot of the companies had one core fault. And if you went back over all these cycles and you looked at the graveyard of companies and organizations that failed or died, they all had their own reasons in some way. Some of them were idiosyncratic to technology, management teams, historical cycles, but they all shared one very particular similarity, which was something that we call a false historical bias. And we have to be very careful about that now, because what a false historical bias will do is it will force you to look with very, very severe blinders on without looking at a broader picture. Humans tend to be very, very short-sighted in their historical context, which is why I would encourage you, the most important thing I think any executive can do in this period of time is become a really astute student of this pattern and understanding the pattern, because once you understand it and your historical context is wider, you can start to begin to figure out what the behaviors are that end up making things successful for the companies that transition in these periods. And I would say to you, when we look at our industry, I spend, as Nick mentioned, the vast majority of my day is spent building new ventures and building companies and brands for celebrities. So I run a division of Creative Artists Agency, a joint venture with them, where we build a lot of the new ventures, things like Fit 5.2 with Carrie Underwood. And our group has been responsible for many brands with talent. And so we spend a lot of our time looking at these cycles and trying to figure out what is the right place to launch the right brand at the right moment. And I would say that there are a couple things, just to end off on, that you can do now. Things that are clearly definable, that we see throughout these patterns that always repeat themselves. And the first thing I would tell you is breathe. This is going to be a pattern. We are in the midst of the confusion cycle now, where we are starting, everyone is trying to figure out exactly, it's like waking up in the morning and you're wiping off your eyes, trying to see clearly. We're in that phase, but it is very common to experience panic, but generally speaking, the calm is the best approach, because we will come out the other end. It is a pattern, and you will see that very clearly. I think the companies that we've watched have some really core tenets that help them survive these periods. Companies like John Deere, who ended up going from a hand tiller business selling basically rakes to betting on the combustion engine, which changed the way the world eats, to now betting on AI, being one of the only real level 5 autonomous vehicles in the field today. They're a great example of companies that survive these multiple rewrites of the planet. So the first thing I would say is, regardless of what you do for a living and regardless of the companies you work for, have a theory. What the public markets and private markets are rewarding now is not just performance. It's not just profitability. It's show me a theory of the world, show me how you're going to take me into that, make it believable, and drag me along with you. And you can see that in the masterclass in that is Elon Musk. Elon Musk has changed the way the public market dynamic and discourse happens. He has created a theory of the world, and he is dragging everyone with it. People with that theory, and Pippa referred to this earlier, and I agree with this 100%, now is the time for imagination, and the markets will reward that imagination, historically speaking. So it's really critical to have that theory of the world. Secondly, I would say the old adage of under promise, over deliver is no longer relevant. And I think, again, what is being rewarded is the companies that grossly overpromise and half deliver. Because generally speaking, it is the story of Apple. If you look at Apple as a context, when Apple delivers a product, you can watch at any given moment when they are pitching the product on whether it's the live event or their launches, or even when they're doing it without a face to it. The product is grossly overpromised. And generally when you get it, it's probably about half of what the promise was, but it's so much better than everyone else that it's good enough and the best, and you stay committed to the brand. It's the same experience with a lot of the great brands in the world. They tend to grossly overpromise. They half deliver, but that half delivery is so much better than everyone else, it just drags the market forward. So the real art form in closing up here, in my experience, that you really have to think about and you really have to be focused on is define that theory, make sure you understand clearly what you are promising, stretch those promises, and then ask the question, what is your 10%? So if 90% of the world is going to return to normal, the question is, what is the 10% that is the new normal in your particular sector? And then you want to spend about 20 to 30% of your assets against that new normal during this period. The companies that come out of this in the growth period that are prepared, so once we are in the middle of the reset, you should be amalgamating the army as much as you can physically do from a CapEx perspective, time, human resource. You want to be prepared to look at that 10% new normal. You want to be ready that your capital is spent, focused, so that when the devaluation period begins, which is now starting, that you actually are in a place that you're able to be set when the growth cycle starts. So before, we used to say you want to be spending about 10% of your assets on this growth. I would argue that number is now closer to 20 to 30% of focusing on that 10% new normal that's going to change the industry. An example in our world, just before I close off here, an example in our world is we have been focused on building holographic entertainment for many, many years. And in my prior life, I was the chief innovation officer of one of the largest live event companies in the world, and we were the owners of Coachella. And we put Coachella on stage, and we put a holographic version of Tupac Shakur on stage. And it was kind of gimmicky, and it was interesting, and it generated a lot of buzz, and people were really amazed by how good the quality was. You know, if you fast forward 10 years, where we are now from that, you can see very clearly that one of the things that will come out of this reset, of this rewrite of the planet, is holographic and alternative forms of live are going to become very, very important. And you will see, certainly we spend a very large amount of our time thinking about what are the new channels of live performance, whether it's holographic, new forms of live entertainment delivered through home studios. All of these things that were sort of science fiction become accelerated. And that's the key, is we're going to enter into that acceleration period now, and that's what we're focused on. So get ready for another rewrite of the planet, but calm. This is a very definable, predictable pattern.
Leonard, thank you very, very much indeed for your time. What I'm going to do is invite Paul and Pippa back to join us and hopefully change the view so we can see us all, and then we'll take a few questions. Hi, Pippa. Hi, Paul. Welcome back.
Hello.
Let me just unmute you, Pippa. Brilliant. Well, let me pick up, I suppose, from Leonard's last point there, and maybe I'll start by directing the question at Paul, because of your first graph that you showed about the industries that have impacted the most. I'm sure a vast proportion of the attendees who are joining us today work in the events industry or in the live space. What do you feel? What do you feel the short, medium, and long-term implications are for the sector?
Well, I mean, they know, and we know that the short-term implications are pretty devastating, because you can't hold live events. And as I showed in one of those charts, something like 80+% of businesses in that sector have closed pretty much entirely. I agree that in the long run, we're probably going to get back to something which is largely like what we've seen in the past. I think it's far too easy to make predictions suggesting that the whole world will change as a result of something like this, but some of it will change. Some of it, we are getting more used to doing this kind of thing. I kind of hope actually that fewer people jump on planes in order to give talks when they could do it when they could do it in the way that we're doing it right now. I think the big uncertainty is about the medium term, by which we might mean the next year or two. And I think that will be defined very dramatically by how we respond to the virus, both in terms of the policy and the politics, but also in terms of people's own responses to it. And I think in the next 6 to 9 months, I think increasingly government will find it can't control people's behavior. We've seen more people initially not going to work than I think government intended or expected. We've seen you can see it how you like, but we've seen the National Education Union essentially telling teachers not to cooperate with any idea to go back to work. We know that a lot of parents don't want to send their children back to school, and it may well be that in terms of events and so on, even if we're all allowed to go back to them, then a significant fraction of people will take some time before they decide that that's safe for themselves. So I think the short run is pretty clear. I think the long run is pretty clear. It's the bit in between that I think is still very uncertain.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that. I think when you look at live, my view on this is counter to a lot of people's views. But let me give you a data point. So I'm currently in Vancouver, although I live mostly in Los Angeles, but I'm caught on the right side of the border today. But generally speaking, I got caught here because I sit on the board of what is the largest sporting event in Canada, which is the Rugby Sevens Tour. And the Rugby Sevens Tour will seat about 80,000 people over 2 days in our stadium. This event happened on March 7th, 8th, and 9th. So we were well into COVID. Everyone understood the risks. We were about 48 hours before the city was effectively shut down, although there was lots of discussions of that happening. It was the largest year we had ever had in attendance. So 2 days before the city was shut down, we hosted 80,000 people. If the LA Lakers said game on, or if Spurs said game on and they were going to put people in the stadium, they might not have 65,000 people there, but I would bet my life they'll have 40 to 45,000 people there. And this is sort of what I was back to before, is that we generally do return to normal. The question is, and to Paul's point about flights, right? If you normally take 20 flights a year, it is foreseeable in the medium term that you may reduce that to 18 flights, maybe 17 flights, which for you and I may not be that big of a difference because we may think that one particular meeting, it can be done over Zoom, we don't need to get on a plane. But when you factor that over an entire industry, those 3 less flights that heavy users are taking become significant. So I think that is the core. Most of us will return to normal, and I think live will be no different. I think when people start hosting live events again, they're going to ease in a little bit, but there's going to be a deep need and craving for that human connection and social contact.
Yeah, actually, can I dive in on that same thing? I have to say, as an economist, I get asked, well, what do you think are going to be these new jobs in the future? And I'd say, one of them is this amazing new phenomena called cloud clubbing. And Leonard, it's what you're alluding to, is suddenly we got these rave parties with world-class DJs. I think it was Zouk in Paris had a gig and it got blown by COVID. So he's like, I'm going online. Like literally you could see hundreds of thousands of people getting online to hear the music of a DJ. And this, I think, is going to be the new way you find out what's the new cool music. You're not going to listen to the radio for that. You're going to listen to cloud coming. And if anybody hasn't gotten on to, I think it's called Morning Gloryville on Saturdays, amazing kind of global party going on. And same thing, digital or esports. I mean, it's like a multiple of what real sports is about. And if you don't understand that, it doesn't make any sense to you. But this is the sort of thing we need to learn. And to your point, Leonard, about the future, it's what you said is a lot like what William Gibson always says. The future comes at different speeds for different people. And we all want to be the people in that 10% that sees the future, gets in front of it, and then frankly spends the rest of our time trying to explain it to the other 90%. And that's its own thing. And you explained a little bit how you have to do that. But I do think that we will go back to this kind of world that does grow. For reference, I wrote a piece a few years ago about one of these resets, and it's on LinkedIn. Again, we'll get the link to you, but it's about tally sticks. So for 1,000 years, the British used a system called tally sticks, which were wooden boards you cracked in half. And this was the system of money and accounting, and it kept a record of every single transaction of your whole life. Tax payments, what did you own? And then because there was so much debt from all the wars being conducted in Europe, the British finally went, we can't pay this debt off and we need to inflate. But there was no way to inflate because you got to take time for the trees to grow and then you got to cut them down. And they said, we're going to use a new technology called paper money. And people were like, are you out of your mind? You think I'm going to give up my wooden board that practically has my name on it for a little piece of paper that doesn't? And the government said yes. And we took all the tally sticks to Parliament and burned them, expropriated them for people's houses and burned them. And this is what caused Parliament to burn to the ground in 1834, was misjudging the heat that would be thrown off. But what it was is the reset. It was the destruction of the system of money and accounting and the introduction of a new one. And I think today's equivalent is we're going to digital money, and there won't be any smoke this time. It'll happen, and if you blink, you will miss it. But it's a radical...
We'll just burn Parliament down for other reasons.
Yeah, blink for other reasons.
Pippa, a question that got posed to you, but I'll pose it to everyone, but we'll start with you, Pippa, is there one question that you're being just repeatedly asked right now? And what are most people worried about who they're talking to you about?
Everybody's worried that they're just going to be permanently unemployed and it's going to be the 1930s all over again. And so my answer to that is, there are two interpretations of what happened at that time in history. One is Ben Bernanke, who's considered the go-to expert, who basically said government intervened and that saved us. And the other is Amity Shlaes in her book, The Forgotten Man, where she says, we would have had a very quick recovery, except government intervened so heavily in trying to control the price and production levels of everything from milk to steel that they prolonged the slowdown. I'm with Amity Shlaes, and I think as long as we don't make terrible policy mistakes, we're going to bounce back. And I'd add to that, we just added an epic amount of free money into the system. And when government gives you free money at zero interest rates, you're supposed to take it and you're supposed to put it to work. The whole point is to compel you to go do something. And I think maybe the other reset is, yes, we have a period of deflation, but we may have set the seeds and the stage for a period of more inflation than we're used to. So that's my nutshell on that.
Paul, I wonder if you've got a response to that, and also the question that you're being asked about.
Well, mostly it's what's going to happen next. Which I don't know. I mean, who knows the answer? I mean, a lot of the questions that I'm asked are about the, are we going to go through another period of austerity because we've had this huge increase in debt, huge increase in deficit, and the outlook for the economy is uncertain. To which the answer is, I don't think we will, for two reasons. First, because hopefully we'll get back onto a decent growth trajectory. And secondly, because I don't think there is scope for any more austerity. I mean, there's little scope for increased for another period of spending reductions. But we may, as I said in the presentation, have to get used to being somewhat poorer than we were previously for at least a period. So. People continue to ask me to look into the future, to which I say I don't know the answer, and nor does anyone else. I mean, on this issue of where are we going to go with inflation and all this extra money that's being pumped into the economy, I think it's a real big uncertainty. We've had 300 billion of borrowing, that we're going to have 300 billion of borrowing this year, 200 billion of quantitative easing, interest rates down at 0.1%. In most normal circumstances, you'd think that we were laying the grounds for a period of inflation after that. The Bank of England actually thinks inflation will go through a period of deflation initially because of what's happening to world commodity prices. But I think we've got a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to prices. And I think it's absolutely right. The key question in all of this is, how is government going to respond? How's it going to respond with its furlough scheme, which is, as I said, terribly difficult to get right and to get out of in the correct way? How's it going to respond when it comes to seeing a significant deficit going forward? Is it going to try and take that down too fast or too slow? How's the Bank of England going to respond when the economy starts growing? There's lots of scope actually for getting policy wrong, as well as for getting policy to support a recovery.
Leonard, let me ask you a question. We've been posed a question about the environment and how it's very much in the news and benefiting from the pandemic's effect on the global economy. Do you see as part of the post-COVID recovery that we're going to go back to our negative onslaught onto the environment, or is this a change, a reset in terms of our view?
Yeah, I think another way to look at these reset moments is what they catalyze. And by the way, I think I probably get the same question that Paul gets all the time, other than where can you get an illegal haircut? That was probably the number one question I get. But after that, it is mostly like, what is really that 10%? What is next? And you will see a lot of charlatans come out of the woodwork over the next year talking to you about the new normal and what you have to do, and how this is, it's an opportunity for people to sort of poke through the haze a little bit. And I think the climate change argument is going to be one of those hazy waters. But I think what will happen, and what you're starting to see happen, is these three kind of forces occur at once that are sort of catalytic. One is, most people that are over the age of 35 to 40 can already witness now and see climactic change in their life cycle. They can witness it. They can physically see the tangibility of it. When I was a kid, I grew up in Alberta, and generally it was minus 30 in about September. So when it was Halloween, the art form was, how did you get a Halloween costume over a snowsuit? That was sort of that was the most important thing, is how you could do that. It doesn't really snow in Alberta now until the middle of end of November. So I think you have people that are seeing it and alive to witness it, number one. Number two, I think you have a generation of people under the age of 35 whose consumption patterns are really focused on being very aware and very cognizant of the environmental choices they're making. So they will force companies onto that agenda. And we see that now, by the way, at CAA, the agency. A lot of our talent and a lot of the deals we look at, climate change and environmental issues are table stakes now. It's not a sideshow and a sidecar of the conversation. It's a fundamental part of that conversation. So I do think those two things, combined with what we have seen of the positive of COVID from the environment, the slowdown and the smog reductions and the traffic reductions, I think those three things are going to accelerate a conversation that should have been accelerated a long time ago.
Thank you very much. So I have two final questions. One has been asked a couple of times, and I feel we have to address it, even though maybe we were instructed to avoid the whole thing. And the other one we'll round off with. So the first question, impact of this on Brexit. We've been asked 2 or 3 times by various people. Anyone got a quick answer to that, or at least something to say?
Well, it's one of the few silver linings, isn't it, that we stopped talking about Brexit for a while. I mean, I don't think it's going to make any difference to the long run. The government's clearly going to move us towards. We're out in principle outside anyway. We're going to move out of the EU and out of the single market. And so on. As everyone knows, they're still saying that this will still happen at the end of this year. It provides some cover to extend the period of negotiation. That period always looked, even ignoring the possibility of this kind of crisis, it always looked incredibly ambitious, except for a government that was fairly set on not achieving much in the way of a close trade deal in any case. So it's possible that it will delay the outcome, but I don't think it will make a difference to the nature of the outcome for the UK. I mean, it's of course creating a series. It's not just here that we're focusing on other things. The EU itself is focusing on a whole bunch of other things at the moment, including a number of strains that this creates and a number of problems that it creates for the European Union itself. So even if the teams, as they are busily negotiating, the political attention paid on both sides of the channel is less than it otherwise would have been. And that's the sort of thing that could either lead to more serious mistakes than otherwise would have been if this does get pushed through at the same speed, or the sort of lack of attention which might require in the end for it to be pushed back. But one thing I will say about this government and what they've said about Brexit is that when they've said that they will do things at speed, at a particular speed, they really have gone and done everything they can to do it at that speed. So I certainly wouldn't write off the probability that this will happen to the timetable as set out pre-crisis.
I was going to say, Nick, so I was an advisor for my sins to the British government during the Brexit period, and did my best to help them navigate that process. But bottom line is, as a manufacturer here in the UK, I can tell you that Britain is very competitive, and this relocalization of production is now in full swing. And I think we're going to see a world where British engineering and British ingenuity is now able to compete in the world economy in a way that it wasn't because of China 10 or 15 years ago. And second, the new war that we're in is a war against viruses. That's the new defense spending. And the epicenter of biomedical research outside the United States is North London, the King's Cross Crick Institute, the Wellcome Trust, and the Oxford-Cambridge Triangle. So we're now literally at the center of the coordination on medical research and really on a par with what's possible in the United States. So these two things alone make me very optimistic about Britain's future in spite of Brexit.
I mean, listen, I'm not a UK citizen, nor do I live there, so I don't want to opine on Brexit specifically, but I will leave one thought on that, which is one of the things that keeps me up at night around the economic circumstances and political circumstances surrounding COVID is these kinds of cycles, as they get deeper and deeper, start to create geopolitical behaviors that can become dangerous. And I think I am not up at night about the economics of all of this, because I feel the economics are a fairly defined pattern. What does keep me up at night is this the trigger that causes a geopolitical conflict that we can't control? Yeah. And that is probably, for me, the scariest part of this. And you can look at different parts of the world where you can sort of see the fire is lit and it's just waiting for fuel. And this may or may not be that unfortunate fuel. So that's, and I think those behaviors, whether they're nationalist behaviors or they are territorial behaviors, sometimes can become the dirty underside of these kinds of cycles.
Okay, so let me try and finish this on a positive note. Let me come to each of you in turn, maybe in the order that we spoke. And we've had a question which says, if you each could individually imagine an ideal outcome of the situation right now, can you briefly, in a couple of sentences, sum up to us what it would look like? If we go to you, Paul, first.
An ideal outcome, well, I mean, not a bad outcome would be if it, in the long run, didn't do any damage, which is sort of don't do any harm kind of outcome. I'm not someone who actually generally thinks that these big crises result in great big good things coming out of them. I don't see very much good that came out of the 2008-2010 crisis. But if I had to be, if you're forcing me to be optimistic, which is not my natural state of being, I think there are a few possibilities, aren't there? I mean, one we've touched on, which is that there may be some positive move towards on climate change. People may fly less. People may appreciate the clean air more, and people may actually become less materialistic as they've experienced a different way of living for several months. I think that's one possibility. I'm not saying it's a probability. Another is about the way that we organize work. Many of us, though not by any means all of us, have come to understand that there are quite a lot of things that one can do from home, and particularly actually when it comes to the role of women in the workplace, where particularly in London and the UK, the commuting time is a real problem for parents. I think we might see some changes. We might see some changes there in the way that people use their time, and that could have positive equalizing effects. We could also see, whilst I think most of what we're seeing is going to push towards, or a lot of what we're seeing, as I indicated, is pushing towards some aspects in which inequality might grow. You can think of ways in which this might reduce inequality. First, those with significant wealth in stocks and shares and housing may see that coming down, which may be good for the younger generation. We may see some more onshoring of manufacturing, which is definitely good for those with lower sort of academic skills, and may be good for reducing inequalities in some ways. And we may also see a reduced focus on the value of living in places like London, particularly in the UK, and therefore more of a levelling up across the country. So if you had to force me, those are the things that I think might be on the positive end.
I know it was painful, Paul, but thank you very much indeed. Pippa.
No, I think COVID in one way is a gift, because now we value time differently. And I think we're going to value relationships differently. And we've reached out, we've realized who's really important to me, and how much time do I invest in those people that are really important to me, or in those ideas, or in those books, or physically, how I look after my body, how much time am I exercising? Suddenly that restoration of valuing time and relationships, I think, is an amazing reset that's going to be very positive. And frankly, again, back to imagination. I mean, people have had to exercise imagination. All you have to do is go on Instagram or TikTok, and you just see some extraordinary acts of imagination going on, and some of them are hilarious. And, that's good. We've restored our sense of play and imagination, and that, things happen, but life goes on. So that fundamental optimism and caring for other people and their circumstances, I just don't think we're going to be as hard-hearted as we had been before COVID. And I think that's good.
Thank you, Pippa. Leonard.
There are two things that I think are going to be really positive that come out of this. I think the first is a rapid rise in the world of small business and entrepreneurship. I think as people start to lose their jobs, they are going to be able to perform and ideally get a bit of support from government in doing that, their side hustles and their smaller careers. And that is critical for any Western economy. If you look at the vast majority of employment, it comes from the small business and SME sector. So I think this is going to drive a lot of people into that, whether they want to or not. But one of the things positive that we did see come out of 2008 was a real rise, certainly in the United States and Canada, of the side hustle and entrepreneurship and the choice of, when I'm 18 or 20, do I want to take my first 5 years of risk in my life at a university, or do I want to build something? And I think you will see a big push towards more entrepreneurship that beefs up the SME sector. I think the second thing that is going to be very positive out of this is a massive technological acceleration. I think you will start to see, the industries like Pippa works in, and robotics and drones, and anything that will accelerate the supply chain risk, getting rid of that, making sure that you have business continuity planning. I think a lot of the people that were talking about all of this are now going to be very forced into the position to accelerate that. And this will be a defining moment, much like 2001 was and 2008 was, for individual countries to take that throne. And arguably in 2001, it was the United States. I would argue in 2008 to 2012, it was Israel that really, really surpassed a lot of the other technological economies. And the question, it's unclear who it will be this time around. Arguably, it looks like it'll be China. But at the end of the day, I think those are the two big positives, is that rise of entrepreneurship pumping up the small business economy and this huge technical acceleration.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Pippa, for a truly fascinating and insightful hour and a quarter. Thoroughly enjoyed by myself, and I trust everyone who was watching. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciated you joining us. If you'd like to know more about Paul, Pippa, Leonard, or how to run your virtual event, or anything else we can be helpful with, we're all here at Speaker's Corner ready to chat. It's been an honor spending time with everyone. Thank you very much indeed. Have a great day and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.